thanks very much to the Sanctuary for hosting this film. It's such an important work. And just as a way of introducing it, I just wanted to tell a very quick story. And for many of you, I imagine your experience in the 1980s sort of politically was somehow similar to mine. The issue of South Africa was just so dominant. We spent so much time thinking about South Africa, engaging in boycotts against the companies that did business in South Africa, and so on. And to the point where South Africa and apartheid became really the symbol of oppression. And we would use the term apartheid almost callously at times. I remember a student protest at my undergrad school against housing regulations. And we were saying, this is just like apartheid. When I was going back and looking at the photos, saw all these analogies that were being made in the late 1980s. And so in some ways it became something as a surprise to me in the spring of 1998 when I was studying Jerusalem. I was with a group of students and we decided to go to Gaza. And we showed up at the border and there was a problem with my visa. It had expired, which is the problem. And I'm talking with the guards and we're trying to sort of negotiate our way in and trying to figure out my friend's just gonna leave me behind. I'll just sit at the border until they come back. And this fellow drives up named Ryland Paulson. Now, Ryland Paulson, I have his title here. He was the first secretary, the South African representative to the Office of the Palestinian National Authority. And he had an office in Ramallah where I had met him about 6 weeks before on another trip that a group of us had taken up to Ramallah. And he had talked to us a little bit about, and he just drove up and he vouched for me and for the other people, and they let us all through. And the amazing part was, so we piled into his car and he gave us a tour of Gaza, sort of through his eyes, through a representative of the African National Congress. And he took us all around. I remember him taking us to Abu Mazen's, who was Arafat's sort of #2 person, sort of this palace that he sort of built himself in some ways with funds that were given to the PNC. We saw Yasser Arafat's home that was there. He drove us really throughout, many of the slums of Gaza, these beautiful skyscrapers that are sort of high-rises that had been built that were utterly empty, these hotels that they would set the tables every day hoping that guests would arrive and there was no one there. And he said this one really interesting thing that has stuck with me really ever since. And he says, as bad as we had it in South Africa, we never had it this bad. And sort of my whole kind of conception of what was going on in Israel and in Gaza and the West Bank really began to be kind of realigned in some ways. I was already sort of very much aware, but not to that extent. So the thing that was the symbol of oppression wasn't even strong enough to represent what he was showing us. It was really quite powerful. So I'm very, very grateful to the filmmakers for making this a really incredible film that shows both the ideological and the material and economic links that have existed between Israel and apartheid South Africa, really since the founding of both societies. Roadmap to Apartheid has won many, 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 many awards, and deservedly so. I'll just give you a few of them. So it's won award at film festivals in Milan, in Manhattan, the Garden State Film Festival, Honolulu, the Durban International, the Arab Film Fest, Atlanta Film Festival, and others. Desmond Tutu has said about the film that Roadmap to Apartheid is very powerful and compelling. Religion is repeatedly misused by politicians, yet one of the lessons of Jewish history is that God is always on the side of the oppressed, and I'm not sure if I entirely agree with that. But another is that those who dehumanize others dehumanize themselves. Israelis will pay a very heavy price for their callous mistreatment of Palestinians. Naomi Klein said about the film, it's a harrowing expose of Israel's unique system of official discrimination. After the film, we'll have a question and answer session with the filmmakers, and we'll have a chance to introduce them there and encourage them to talk a little bit about the film. But for now, I just would like to go to the film. Thanks very much for coming.
This is the beautiful land of Israel and Palestine. The world's 3 largest religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, consider it Holy Land. Each year, millions of people from around the world come here to pray for peace and prosperity. Yet this land is also a major center of conflict in the world today. For Jewish Israelis, the conflict centers on protecting a homeland created for the Jewish people in 1948. For Palestinians, it is about resisting decades of colonialism, expulsion, occupation, and apartheid. Most people identify apartheid with the grotesque system of control that existed in South Africa from 1948 to 1994, in which the white minority ruled over the black majority, stole their land, and deprived them of basic rights. It was a system reviled by the whole world, and it eventually crumbled under the combined pressure of internal resistance and international sanctions. Today the word is back, and with it too is a growing global movement to end the Israeli version of apartheid.
Sure. Thank you so much for coming out, all of you. It's a great turnout. And thanks again to the Sanctuary for putting this on. A really well-organized event. What better way to kick off a discussion than to perhaps point out a terrible, glaring omission in our film? And that is, you just watched a film about the apartheid analogy, the comparison where we look at a lot of Israel's laws and practices, its goals and justifications side by side to the same in South African history. And that comparison, that analogy is important to make, but there's also something very important that's outside of that comparison, and that is the crime of apartheid. So in 1973, the United Nations codified into international law the United Nations Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid. And it made apartheid a crime, and it applies to all countries. And it defined very well that crime, line by line, and Israel clearly contravenes that crime almost 100%. So it's just a very important distinction between the crime of apartheid that Israel clearly contravenes and this analogy, this comparison. The analogy is important as well because it helps flip a switch in somebody's mind. You know, everyone says, oh, well, I was against apartheid in South Africa. We all were. Who wasn't? And then they see so many similar things side by side, and hopefully that will flip something in their minds to think, well, I need to reconsider my support for Israel's policies. So, important distinction.
Yeah, the definition of the Convention Against the Crime of Apartheid was actually our opening scene for many versions of the film, but over the course of editing, we somehow lost it and forgot to put it back in, so we're telling you about it.
Better we tell you about it first before somebody outs us and points it out, right? We're really eager to hear your questions, comments, critiques, feedback.
I learned more about the situation in the last 90 minutes than I ever had in my life. And the fact that you do end on the divestment strategy, that was very similar to what happened with South Africa. Another thing that happened was large movements of marches, and you showed some, but obviously it's the early days of that. Is there anything else that you would suggest that we as an audience can do, and any place that we can go for solutions that we can actively take part in?
Well, there's local organizers here who work on this issue and could probably speak more about what you could do in Troy. But in terms of the global boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, it is one of the most powerful tools people outside of Palestine can help with this cause. You know, for one, it really helps local communities start the debate in their own communities. If a local store is having a debate about whether or not to have an Israeli product or a settlement product on their shelves, bringing it up to the community and saying we want this off our shelves just helps to start the debate. And it is so sorely needed in this country where the media is clearly one-sided on this topic and miseducates the public. So the BDS campaign is really important, and it does give the Palestinians some leverage, having that kind of visible and loud and audible international support. It gives them a lot of inspiration and courage too to keep going. So we were just there in January, and everybody's really impressed by how fast the boycott movement is growing. And
there was a part of the film when they were talking about Israel supporting South African apartheid with weapons. I think it was during the 80s mostly. I know now Israel gets a lot of their weapons and a lot of support from the U.S. I don't know if the U.S. was supplying weapons to Israel back then. I'm just wondering if the U.S. was supplying apartheid South Africa with weapons through Israel.
yeah, yes.
If the U.S. was supplying apartheid South Africa with weapons, period, or through Israel? Oh. I don't think so, because during the 70s, I'm fairly certain that Israel wasn't getting a lot of its weapons from the United States at that point. Really, South Africa and Israel were a bloodline for each other throughout the 70s and 80s. But I know that Israel was getting its main fighter jet from France during the 70s. And so I don't think that relationship really steamrollered between the United States and Israel until later on. So my answer to that is I think not.
But South Africa, I mean, the United States supported South Africa pretty much until through the end of the 80s, when it was clear that the apartheid government was on its way out. It had this policy of constructive engagement. It said that it's better to work with them than outright sanction them. And so there was a lot of gray area products that the U.S. sold to South Africa that were used for military purposes, even though they weren't classically defined as for military use only. So there was a ton of support from the U.S. anyway. Yep.
So one piece of that relationship between Israel and South Africa, goes back to some of those very core institutions that founded the states, and the one I have in mind in particular is the kibbutz movement. And many of you may be familiar with sort of this Israeli sort of sense of its own past, that Israel was formed by the socialist communities that were initially agricultural and then sort of became more industrial. Many of those kibbutzim, which is the plural, in the 1980s and the 1990s began moving heavily towards industry, and some of them making weaponry for the South African government. One of the people doing that was an old roommate of mine who was not aware of what he was doing. We were roommates in college, and he had just come back from a kibbutz, and he said his job was he was just assembling electronic parts, and then a fellow member of the kibbutz from Germany came to visit and said, well, you know where those were going, don't you? And explained that these were ultimately ending up in weapons that were on their way to South Africa in violation of the global boycott. So it really goes down to even these core institutions that we often associate with the political left, really become just fully instrumentalized towards Israeli national goals. Yeah, please.
I had gone to Israel and worked on a kibbutz for about half a year. And before that, I was in the Peace Corps and had traveled extensively through Africa, including South Africa. And I was in my 20s then, and I figured it out in 1969 that this was apartheid. And so the whole idealization of the kibbutz, in fact, at that time, they were hiring Palestinian labor to do the work of the kibbutzim, and I just saw it.
Yep. This actually goes back to the very beginnings of the movement. There's this wonderful book called Land, Labor, and the Palestinian Crisis, and it talks about how in the 1890s, when these very first settlements really began, they couldn't make a profit, and so they started looking for investors. And of course, investors want to see a return, and there was a realization among the managers that Palestinians would work for a cheaper wage than these Europeans, Russian Jews who were coming to work on these movements. And so you begin to see this class divide set up, and in the very earliest stages, before the crises that we learn about later, the riots that take place, in Hebron in the 20s and in the 30s and the various clashes. This kind of class differential that gets put in place, which then gets constructed along national lines, goes back to the very, very first settlements that are created by Europeans making their way to then Palestine.
Current status of the Boer minority in South Africa and the potential for genocide there. There's a nonprofit organization called Genocide Watch that issued a watch. It's in stage 5 towards genocide. They obviously have listed places like Sudan and Syria as ripe for genocide, but also South Africa due to the murder of approximately 3,000 Boer farmers over the past decade. Do you see role reversal there? Are you familiar with that situation?
I have not heard of the Genocide Watch in South Africa, and yeah, I don't actually know anything about that. But in terms of South Africa, only 4% of the land of South Africa has been transferred to the majority population. I mean, apartheid didn't really end.
Right.
There was democracy, but apartheid has not ended, and the conditions for the majority of the population hasn't really changed. So there's definitely a lot of anger in South Africa that, we fought so hard for this democracy, but it actually hasn't proven anything substantial in our daily lives. So I don't know about that, but unfortunately, in the negotiations to end apartheid, there was still, Mandela allowed for a lot of neoliberal economic policies to continue and the wealth stay in the hands of the minority white community.
I appreciate the fact that you condensed your discussion, your presentation to the comparisons between South Africa and Israel. And there's so much that you could have put in, but you defined your focus, and I think that was very effective. Could you speak to any of the difficulties that you had in terms of restrictions or whatever within Israel and occupied land?
Well, we were shooting most of it in 2007, and the West Bank, things comparatively weren't too troublesome or explosive in the West Bank, and so we didn't have much of a hard time at all. I got detained a few times briefly, but nothing to speak of, really. The only real challenge or restrictions that we came upon, which was significant, at the time, Gaza was hermetically sealed. Nobody got in and out, except for a few UN agency workers. These days, it's a little easier for some people to get in and out, but we couldn't get into Gaza to do any research or shooting. So Other than that, that was our only restrictions that we came across with the IDF for the Israeli government, aside from a few governmental denials of interviews.
Yeah, please, right here. Thanks, Miles.
I'm also with the Palestinian Rights Committee locally, and one of the things that we've done over the last 30 years is we've done a considerable education campaign. And in the 1980s, it was to try to bring the peace groups in the capital region around so that they would be more comfortable with the issue. And I think they would have come around anyways, but we helped it along. And I think that's the most important thing, is to just educate people, because so many people think they know this issue well and they really don't know it at all. I see letters written to the newspaper by Jewish people who are obviously good people, but they don't have a clue as to what's going on in Israel and the occupied territories. And the other thing I'd like to compliment you on the film is that you made very well, you made the point that Israel is a sham of a democracy because they ethnic cleansed a huge group of people out of the country, and then they deny rights to millions of people. And you can't pretend that you're a democracy. You're not a democracy if that's the way you behave. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just read today that there was a study done in England of youth who watch television news and get their news from TV. 90% of those surveyed thought that the illegal settlers were Palestinians. They actually did not know anything about the situation, had most of it reversed. It's quite amazing how miseducated people really are.
In the United States, the more TV news you watch, the stupider you become.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually what I was about to add to the report that she just read, is that there was a correlation in the study that the more news that these people surveyed watched, the less they knew than the others. So that says something about the corporate media that's controlling all the flow of information, which is why places like this sanctuary of alternative media is so important.
My question was about the U.S. government and its involvement with the Israeli government, and how you said in the 70s not many of the weapons were coming from the U.S. and they were more independently trading, and how like the cozy relationship sort of came about between the U.S. and Israel as we see it today, and what you think like the role of the U.S. is in this conflict.
Well, clearly that's, that relationship is protecting Israel from any repercussions to its violations of human rights against the Palestinians. You know, there's an interesting statistic actually, which also you can draw a lesson on from this analogy, is that in the history of the United Nations Security Council, all of the US vetoes, 50% of all US vetoes were vetoing resolutions condemning Israel's policies, so to protect Israel. An additional 30% of all US vetoes in the history of the Security Council were vetoes against resolutions condemning South African apartheid government from violations. In total, 80% of all the US vetoes in the history of the United Nations Security Council were to protect these two apartheid governments. So the Palestinians probably have a tougher mountain, higher mountain to climb because of this extremely strong relationship that the US and Israel has. But we have to remember that the US supported the apartheid government to the end until pressure from the grassroots, from the people, forced the US government to change its support for South African government. The Afrikaners, the white government in power in South Africa during apartheid, didn't have such a strong lobby entrenched in our government as Israel does. They didn't have a diaspora of white Afrikaners around the world, such as the Jews do. So it's a much stronger relationship, and the Palestinians do have a higher mountain to climb. But it is something worth noting that the US supported the South African apartheid government until pressure from below became too much.
And just to add, today the US is giving Israel $8 million a day in subsidies and military aid. And you know, they in turn use that money to buy weapons from us. So it's sort of like a subsidy win-win for Israel and the, our weapons manufacturers here in the U.S. But Israel serves as a I guess, a military base for the West in the Middle East, and I think that's part of the incentive and part of why all of these wars are interrelated and important to fight them all.
I was curious regarding the composition of the settlers. Where do they fit in Israeli society? I had once been told that these were people who, many of whom had just immigrated from the former Soviet Union and were not necessarily accepted in larger Israeli society, that in many cases they themselves were cast out and pushed out. If not overtly, then perhaps more subtly, and maybe not so subtly. So where do they fit into the general picture? Thank you.
I think there's a wide gamut of who the settlers are. There are some religious zealots, those are generally the ones who start with caravans and small little outposts on hilltops that they want to take over. They're there, they're not forced out. The government then feels that they need to protect them, so they set up a military post around them to protect them, and then the military post needs communication systems, so then they set up cell phone towers, and suddenly infrastructure builds, and you've got a town, and then the town grows into a city. The big cities, they've built highways and now train lines to make it really easy to commute into Israel from the settlements, and the Israeli government offers subsidies to people who move there. So for a large extent, I think that people move there because it makes sense economically too. It's a convenient place to live. There's quick transport to Tel Aviv, whatever. It's not always an ideological or a political move from their perspective. Maybe you want to add to that.
Just another piece. I mean, you're absolutely right that there is this wide spectrum, that there's some who really believe that this is part of their promised land, refer to it as Judea and Samaria and so on. And then there's others who go there because there's economic opportunity. You're absolutely right that many of the new sort of citizens of the state, Jews who come from abroad become citizens. Some do so for economic reasons. Some aren't actually Jewish and claim it because it's just a path, hopefully, to a better life for themselves. They're very, very often pushed out to these cities that are being created. I don't mean to tell too many stories, but I had a roommate when I lived in Jerusalem who was a migrant, who had converted to Judaism from Austria, and we were living in Jerusalem. He just took the bus every day to Ariel because he was given technical training, all this paid for by the state, and that just happened to be where his school was. And Israel is now about to make the university in Ariel one of the state universities. So there's several major state universities, in Jerusalem, Beersheba, Haifa, other places. Tel Aviv. They're going to make Ariel, a settlement, now have an Israeli state university there. And so it's going to draw, hundreds, if not thousands of more people to come just, for an education.
Hi.
It's the microphone from heaven coming.
I was interested in your talking about the Boers as being victims. I had never, and how they got partially into this mindset. I hadn't really thought of it that way before, but I've certainly thought a lot about Jews feeling like victims, and they really were, in terms of the German massacres. But I read this book a couple years ago, The Holocaust is Over, We Must Rise from the Ashes, and it just seemed like such a useful direction to pursue, and I haven't known quite what to do with it, but I did think it was very valuable insight.
Thanks. Do you want to say something?
Thank you.
I don't know if there was a question to that.
Yeah, did you have a question?
Well, I wonder how you see his point of view that we've got to stop thinking of ourselves as victims and go on to the future, right, in a positive way.
I mean, certainly Jews have a long, long history of oppression that shouldn't be forgotten, but cannot be used as justifications for, in turn, oppressing another people. We should be able to remember the Holocaust and all the other pogroms and oppression in history. We should be able to talk about it, and we should be able to talk about that not being used as justifications to what they're currently doing to the Palestinians.
And just if I could say one other piece about it. I mean, I think it's important to understand that there were very few options, for European Jews in particular. At the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, their options were running out, and so, as someone who thinks about Jewish history all the time, as part of my job, I have sort of deep compassion for the situation that Jews in Europe were in. In really starting from the 1880s and really going through the Second World War, there's just very few places for Jews to go. Their own communities are not really allowing them to exist as they are, and most other places in the world are sort of shutting them out. Nevertheless, your point is absolutely right, that all of this can't be used as justification for the displacement of another population. It has to be sort of channeled into the other options, I think, that were available at the time about creating democratic societies, and that's where the focus was for many Jews then. Of course, many of them were eliminated during the war, but it needs to be sort of our work now.
What do you see as Israel's future? Because it seems like many of the secular younger people are migrating, and more and more very ultra-religious Jews, particularly from the United States, Brooklyn and so forth, are emigrating. And you have this very right-wing government. So what do you see as its future, as well as the future of Zionism?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the more Israel is passing more and more restrictive laws, more and more racist laws, more and more laws that, that clamp down on dissent even within its own borders, declaring that the boycott movement from within is illegal, and more censorship laws. I think the more it tightens up and restricts, the more it's just realizing that its days are kind of numbered, because the world is learning more and more about this despite the corporate media. I think the war in Gaza in 2008, 2009 really was like the Sharpeville. If people know what Sharpeville was, it was a changing moment in South African history when people who were protesting the past laws got gunned down, and it became shocking footage all over the world, and the world suddenly woke up to what apartheid was. I think that happened in 2008, 2009 with the Gaza war. A lot more people joined the boycott movement and started finding out what was going on. And I think there is growing pressure, and with all the revolutions in the Middle East, there's all these dictators that have been coming down. I think Israel will eventually have to face up to the fact that it's not a democracy and won't have the support of the entire world. And the US, hopefully won't be able to always support it. So I don't see it, getting worse in the long run. I think in the long run, hopefully, maybe I'm just being way too optimistic, but in the long run, I think if this sort of discussion can happen where Jews don't feel like they're being persecuted, and the idea of a democracy with one state and equal rights can penetrate into that society, I don't know. I have hopes for that.
I vacillate a lot in my head as to my levels of optimism and pessimism. And I often think sometimes, Israel just very well may win. But really, when I think about it, in the end, I come to this conclusion that it's absolutely unsustainable. In the end, it's going to be unsustainable. I don't know when, don't know how, but I really believe it's going to be unsustainable in the end. A lot of people, as you both just mentioned, the Israeli society is getting so far right-wing. It's definitely crossed the line of fascism. And really, there's no hope in focusing your energy on engaging with Israelis as far as changing Israel's policies. I think pressure is going to have to come from the outside world and make the cost for Israel at keeping the status quo so costly that is only then is going to choose to change its policies. And people pin a lot of hope on BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, which is growing so fast compared to the South African history of boycott, divestment, sanctions. But you can't really pin all your hopes on that. You know, a lot of the historians, scholars, anti-apartheid warriors in South Africa that we talk to actually don't accredit all that much to the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement in South Africa for ending South African apartheid. They give more weight to the massive internal resistance, as Naeem Jima said in our movie, the South African Intifada, where the country was absolutely ungovernable. That, coupled with boycott, divestment, sanctions, produced enough pressure on the South African government to change. That's an element right now, these days, that it's missing terribly in in Palestinian side of things, where the state of resistance is very sad, and we don't know when that's going to change. But the day that it does, if there ever is a third intifada similar to the first intifada, BDS will then take off, and we may see a changing day around then.
The Palestinian movement, I agree with you 100% that there has to be a Palestinian movement inside in the Middle East as well. The only problem is, unlike South Africa, the Israeli economy is not entirely dependent on Palestinian labor. There is some Palestinian labor, especially now with the building of industrial zones, which we had industrial zones on the borders of the Bantustans as well. They're building industrial zones on the border of the West Bank, and Palestinians go through checkpoints, enter the factory, work for way less than minimum wage in Israel, and leave. We have that. There is that in Palestine, but it's not anywhere near the level it was in South Africa. So the South African resistance movement could shut down the country literally, and that is absolutely what helped end apartheid. In Palestine, there isn't that leverage, and so there has to be other forms of creative resistance and a lot more international support to bolster them.
So, well, there are still some analysts or scholars that feel that a viable two-state solution is possible. That is, there could be a viable Palestinian state, and the film and the filmmakers here seem to be saying, no, we're way beyond that. It's got to be one state that's democratically governed. So, I mean, I just raised that issue specifically then. For example, Noam Chomsky talks about in the short term, a two-state solution with going back to the 67 borders is what he would prefer. And I've heard others say the same thing. So what do you folks think? That we're way beyond that? We've got, I mean, long term, perhaps a single state. And
I think we both want to say something on this. Yossi Beilin, is that right? He was one of the chief architects on the Israeli side negotiating the Oslo Accords. He recently came out in the New York Times saying the two-state solution is dead. There is no way that is going to happen, and we just need to admit it and move on. So it's not just our opinion, I think. It's a growing sentiment amongst Palestinians and even amongst the Israeli leadership. Condoleezza Rice recently said something similar. The window is rapidly closing. That said, in our film, we bring up the one state not as like, you have to do this, obviously, but as a reminder that it's there, and it has been there for many years. And people, especially young Palestinians who, are under 20, that the two-state solution is all they know. That's all they've grown up with, is the idea that one day they'll have a state. The idea that they could actually have equal rights in one state is a new idea to many of them. So we bring it up as something for them to think about. And ultimately, it's up to them which way it goes. But the two-state solution, as was outlined in Oslo, is not going to happen.
Yeah, and just to tag on the last thing about that is, yes, many people would prefer it, but it's probably not possible. And the important thing to remember about it is, right now, it's a trap. The more time goes on with these fake negotiations about this two-state solution, more and more land is being completely taken away with these huge cities that you can't erase. A city with high-rise buildings of 50,000 population. That's what these settlements looks like. So at this point, it's a trap, is my personal opinion, to focus on the two-state.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for coming, Ana and Eron. We have a round of applause.